So hi and welcome back to the CDFM study group as we continue review of CDFM Module 2.1, the Defense Budget Process. So we're going to pick up on page 2.1.50 as we continue the review. So we just talked about the budgeting phase, and we're going to look now at how this interrelates with the defense acquisition system. So on page 50, it talks about the P process and how it relates with the defense acquisition system. Remember, three systems: JCITS, PPBE, and defense acquisition system. So products of the long range planning guide, both the PPBE process and acquisition process. The research development and acquisition plan, the RDA plan, is a continuous focusing. All right, so lots of words there, just don't need all that. Let's take it down to the slide. Defense Acquisition Board, we touched on the Defense Acquisition Board, and we also talked about the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, which is the USD ATNL. The vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Let's keep that line going. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is also the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So you're going to hear me keep repeating these things so that you can get it in your thought process of how these roles interrelate with one another. So going back to page 50, this is specifically about defense, the USD ATNL. And it talks about on the slide, it shows you USD ATNL is the chairman, the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff being the vice chair of the Defense Acquisition Board and also serves as the chair of the JROC. And the Defense of the Acquisition Board function is to oversee all acquisition related projects. The Defense Acquisition Board reviews, and if you read the first paragraph, Acquisition Category 1 Delta. So there are various acquisition categories that you're going to have to understand. And I don't know if it's in this part, but I know that in Module 3, we cover some of those acquisition categories. But the bottom line, if it's a DOD level, so it's usually by cost. So it's like real expensive in the millions, billions of dollars. So it's an Acquisition Category 1 Delta. The D behind it tells you it's a DOD level program. So that's one way to understand. So that's the function of the Defense Acquisition Board, is to look at these multi-million-dollar requirements before they make a purchase. Is they need to analyze and make sure that it's the right decision to solve the problem. Because again, going back to JCITS, once we identify a capability gap, and we determine we need to buy something, build something, is we need to ensure that our requirement equates to solving that capability gap. So you can read through the rest of 50. 51 talks about the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So again, we're in the acquisition system. But the role of the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. And what it does is helps the Defense Acquisition Board articulate the military needs. So you look at the acquisition, you look at what the military needs are to fill that capability gap. The JROC is that board that then makes sure that all of those things are in sync to still accomplishing what is necessary. So on 51 in the middle, Joint Requirements Oversight Council reviews and identify all needs that cannot be met by current capability. So it needs capability gap. The JROC validates an identified mission need, assigns a joint potential designator for meeting the need. So they don't just say, hey, we got a problem, we can't meet that need, we got a capability gap. They also have to come up with a recommendation in how to fill that capability gap. So it forwards an initial capabilities document with JROC recommendation to the USD ATNL. So the Joint Requirement Oversight Council, once they use JSIDs to come up with a capability gap, they then have to determine, like a commander usually say, don't just come to me with a problem, bring me a solution also. So JROC also comes up with initial capabilities document that lists what they think will fulfill that requirement and fill that gap and submit that requirement to the USD AT&L. Well, guess what? The chairman of JROC also sits on the Defense Acquisition Board with that USD AT&L. So he can make sure that what they say in the JROC is then translated over to Defense Acquisition Board. So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for you to understand where we're coming from. All right, on page 52, I always like charts that have definitions, makes it a little bit easier for you to understand. So we've talked about a few of these words. Okay, I'm going to recap again on page 52. That chart that lists the document title and description. So we've talked about the integrated priority list. As soon as you hear integrated priority list, who writes it? Combatant commander submits it with their requirements. Defense planning guidance or defense planning programming guidance. That's the final document that the Secretary of Defense issues at the end of the planning phase. Who's responsible for the planning phase at the Department of Defense? That's the USD for policy. Program Objective Memorandum, the POM, translates that plan into various programs. Who's responsible for the programming phase? Director of CAPE, and the Director of CAPE is also responsible for updating the Future Year Defense Program. What's the Future Year Defense Program? The DoD database that keeps track of all the forces, equipment, manpower necessary to accomplish your requirement. It utilizes keeps track of the required appropriation used by all the components. Issue books, that's that one-page summary that the OMB and DoD components get together and they analyze the submissions and come up with whatever issue that they have with the submission. Resource management decision, that's the final DoD decision document at the end of the programming and at the end of the budgeting phase that says what the DoD is sending forward. Budget estimate submission, who's responsible for budget? The USD Comptroller. So your BES is the services, the BES is the document that the services submit to the DoD in the budgeting phase. So we've already touched on the Future Year Defense Program, portraying this data by force programs internal. Comptroller Information System is the system that is updated at the end of the budgeting phase by the USD Comptroller. And the President's budget. So all of this budget is building up for addition to the President's budget. So once the DoD gets its budget in line, then they submit it to the Office of Management and Budget for inclusion into the President's budget. So you see how I did all of that simply by that one chart on page 2.1.52. So on page 2.1.53, it talks about that President's budget. So the key there is remembering that the President's budget is due to Congress by law no later than the first Monday in February of the year of the fiscal year starting that October. So that's what's saying there. So a couple of other key words here. The first paragraph talks about the 1974 Congressional Budget Act that requires the President to do that. And also it mentions the word outlays. That's for us, we probably will use the word disbursement, but when it comes to this CDFM, you will see the word outlays. And outlays simply means when the funding is removed from the Treasury to pay for an obligation. That's called an outlay from the Treasury. All right, let's take it over to page 2.1.54. So President's budget. So what happens at Congress when it's time for this whole budget process? What happens? So congressional enactment process that goes through what are the actions that occur at Congress? So it talks about hearings, committees, concurrent budget resolution, congressional authorization, appropriations, and appeals. All right, the annual enactment process. So let's look at committee hearings. One of the first congressional actions relative to the president's budget is taken by the Congressional Budget Office. And that's another key player, and if you don't pay attention, you'll just kind of run right by the Congressional Budget Office. So Congress, when I started off this whole series, I talked about Congress has the Congressional Budget Office. That's their budget keepers. Keep up with the understanding what's our debt number, what's our estimated outlay, what's our budget authority. You got a budget office at Congress. We already talked about the President's Chief Financial Officer, Office of Management and Budget, DOD, USD Comptroller. So the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is responsible for gathering all this data so that Congress knows before they start coming up with guidance, where do we stand? How much debt are we in? How much money did we spend? What's the current state of our budget? So that's what the CBO provides. The CBO reviews the president's budget, and then all of that is submitted to Congress. What you're missing here, and let's see, the third paragraph, the committees in Congress. You have the House and Senate Budget Committee, which is responsible for the concurrent budget resolution. The House and Senate Armed Services Committee, responsible for the authorization bill. And the House and Senate Appropriation Committee, responsible for the appropriation bill. So they don't go as much in depth as you would in Module 1. However, it's a lot of information. So all that means is on Congress, they have different committees responsible for different functions in the enactment process. So Congressional Budget Office responsible for gathering, doing the analysis, gathering all the baselines, letting the entire Congress know where we currently stand. The budget enactment process starts with concurrent. Concurrent means same time. You have your House and your Senate. They have to enact things individually, but they have to come as one document that's approved by both sides. So concurrent budget resolution is done at the bottom of 54 by the House and Senate budget committees. Manage the budget resolution, projected revenue and spending for the target fiscal year. They give their recommendation. They look at what we have. So the concurrent budget resolution, where we're starting, does not go to the president. It's only agreement between the House and the Senate. Where are we starting? What's our baseline? So on page 55 at the top, you have the Congressional Authorization. So when you look at the budget process, it goes from concurrent budget resolution, authorization process, appropriation process. Authorization authorizes the program. It doesn't give us any budget authority, does not give us any money. Authorization is a responsibility of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, period. The second paragraph on the top of 55 talks about the third phase of budget, which is the appropriation phase. That's the one we care about most because that's the one where we get actual funding, an actual budget. The appropriation for defense program is a responsibility of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. So that talks about congressional action once the president. So we talked about the 1974 Congressional Budget Act that requires the president to submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. Congress goes through the concurrent budget resolution authorization process and the appropriation process after they receive the budget from the president. So the bottom of page 55 now goes into the final phase of the P process, which is the execution phase. So once Congress appropriates the money, then we go into what happens after that. The execution phase is the responsibility also of the USD Comptroller. So on page 56, it talks about the DoD appropriation categories. An appropriation can be defined as a result of an act of Congress that allows federal agencies to incur obligations. I want to read the last sentence there. Let's see. The second to last one. Article 1, Section 9 states that no money can be drawn from the U.S. Treasury except as a result of appropriations made by law. So this goes back to prior knowledge that Article 1, because you have three branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 of the Constitution goes accordingly with those branches. So Article 1 automatically tells me that we're talking to Congress. Section 9 is one that states, by law, no money can come out the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law in place. So that is why they say if we don't have a new appropriation or a continuing resolution by 1 October, that the government will shut down, because the law that we have in place is covered under Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. And so the bottom of 56 just looks at the various appropriations that we deal with, but most likely go to page 57's chart that explain MILPERS, O&M, RDT&E procurement, shipbuilding conversion, and military construction. What's key to understand with the appropriation, MILPER and O&M are 1 year or annual appropriations that are expense type. You have your RDT&E, could be expense or investment, and it's available for 2 years. Your procurement appropriations are available for 3 years. And you also have, which they kind of sneak in there, is that shipbuilding, conversion, Navy, SCN, are 5-year appropriations, which is part of procurement, but it has a flavor of SCN, so it's a 5-year appropriation. And it's an investment type, just like your military construction. 5-year appropriation, meaning they are available for you to spend, new obligations against for 5 years. Those years are going to become important to you as you move forward, because you need to understand, if they tell you you have a military construction funding, you know it's available for 5 years for new obligation. We also should know that all appropriation expires for 5 years. So they stay expired. So even though, let's say we're currently in fiscal year 18. Well, although fiscal year 17 is already passed, we know that fiscal year 17 funds stay expired for 5 additional years. And it's the same thing for every appropriation. They stay expired for 5 additional years, which means we can make adjustments within those 5 years. If a bill comes in, it's less, okay, we deobligate the rest of the funds. Or if it's more and we have those prior year funds, we can do that. So make sure you understand the timeline and the type of appropriations on page 57. So the next few pages is going to look at, because we've already talked about some are annual appropriation, good for 1 year, some are multi-year, incremental funding policy. So we're going to look at a few terms here. 58 just means annual. or annual or 1-year appropriations was your MILPERS, meaning it's either active, National Guard, or reserve. So you just say O&M and MILPERS. On page 59 talks about your incremental funding, your research. You're not going to get all your funding up front to do a research. So whatever portions you need to do for this fiscal year, incremental means you just get the funding you need for that year. Incremental means, okay, maybe whatever the next phase is, you get funding for the next year. Page 60, 2.1.60 talks about full funding policies. So that is for your procurement and MILCON. If we're going to buy things, well, whatever it is that we're buying, we typically need a usable end item for our money. So that means we have to pay all that money up front. So 2 primary points about this policy at the bottom of page 60. Usable end items. The military service cannot buy one part of an item 1 year and the next part the next year because it's cheaper. Funded delivery period. This is a 12-month period starting with the month in which a contract is expected. So depending on whenever you enter that contract, your 12 months starts there. So we don't operate on a calendar year or even a fiscal year. If it's a 12-month contract, whatever that 12-month take you out to, that's what you do. So page 61 looks at some exceptions. There's always exceptions to the policies. You just need to know what the exceptions is. So in case of the full funding policy, the exception to the policy is advanced procurement. So advanced procurement, meaning you have a long lead time. So depending on whatever, and we're talking millions of dollars here. So depending on whatever we're purchasing, we may need to pay some upfront to get the process started to ensure that we have the required equipment and capabilities at the point where we need them. So advanced procurement is touched on the bottom of page 61. And when it relates to the acquisition phase, it mentioned advanced procurement may be used when you're trying to do the engineering and manufacturing development phase and full product production. So that's like saying you're developing a new truck, new vehicle for combat. Well, when you're engineering and developing it, you may have to do advanced payment to pay for your initial prototype. Let's put it that way then. So some portions of it. So that's what it's talking about. And even so it's kind of overlapping here with your acquisition, because when you talk about buying these big ticket items, you're now in the acquisition phase. The authorization for the use of advanced procurement funds limits the milestone decision authority's flexibility. So it should only be used when the economic benefits are significant and only with MDA concurrence. So even in the acquisition phase, what it's saying is to go from each phase of that process is the milestone decision authority, which is the lead person in charge of that acquisition, is responsible for concurrence to move from one level to the next or for one cost to the next cost. On page 62, it goes into multi-year procurement. And we talk about your multi-year simply means it's more than 1 year. So that's your 2-year, your 3-year, and your 5-year appropriation. So multi-year is a vehicle that's used. You can read through all of that. I don't really see anything that stands out where I need to point it out. All right, let's see. Continuing stable requirement. Congress has mandated a 2-step multi-year. Okay, so multi-year. All right, so the next thing on page 2.1.64, and I touched a little bit on this before, appropriation lifecycle. So you see appropriations, MILPERS, O&M, RDT&E procurement, SCN, and MILCON. We've already talked about those. They are current. They are available to spend. They are available for new obligation, either 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. All appropriations are expired for an additional 5 years where we can make adjustments, and canceled and closed at the end of that 5 year. So the chart at the bottom of the appropriation life cycle shows you phase 1, current mean available for obligation, for new obligations. Phase 2, when an appropriation is in the expired state, you cannot make any new contracts, new obligations. You can only make adjustments. Third phase, when they enter the canceled or closed state, you lose all accountability or access to those funds. So what then happens to the funds once they are in the closed state? Those funds are then returned to the accountability of the U.S. Treasury. There is an exception on the closed state, because we have those instances where a bill comes in when that appropriation has closed. So a stipulation, which is at the bottom of page 64 under the phase 3, but in case you can't read it, on page 65, there's a 1% rule at the bottom. The last bullet on page 65 says 1% of your total appropriation account being charged for the adjustment or payment. What it's saying is, if I get a bill and that particular account is closed or canceled, I can use about 1% of my current appropriation to pay for that bill. Or they will have to be referred back to DFAS. DFAS has to work with the Treasury to figure out how to get that vendor paid. And let's see what else we have. And so we would continue to obligate funds when they are in the current, when they're in the expired. So potentially, military construction is good for 5 years, expired for 5, so that's 10 years. So it's not until the 11th year that it enters the closed state. And that concludes this portion of CDFM Module 2.1, ending on page 2.1.65, and we will continue later.